The Sine Institute of Policy and Politics is American University's incubator for policy innovation. We convene leaders in the academic, public, private, nonprofit, and journalism sectors to engage and promote common ground and nonpartisan solutions. In an evolving world, we seize the opportunity to work on the nation's most pressing challenges through collaboration by experts and top scholars in their field with students in research and scholarship. As part of that goal, the Sine Institute leverages American University's location in our nation's capital, the nexus of government and a growing international business center. We connect diverse perspectives from around the country and around the world with our world-class academics and research, experienced practitioners, and the most politically active student body in the U.S. We stand apart through our focus on the role of business and the nonprofit community in public policy, the rise of the importance of economic regions in the United States, and international policy issues. Our focus is to make an immediate impact at the intersection of policy and politics that leads to real and lasting change. Thank you for joining us as we convene, communicate, and collaborate.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Sine Institute Fellow Seminar today. My name is Tyler Brown DeWeese, and I am a student associate for the Sine Institute Fellow Patrice Willoughby. Sorry. On behalf of the Sine Institute and myself, we are pleased you have joined us for this event. The Sine Institute is a laboratory for university-wide collaboration and an incubator for policy innovation, convening the best and brightest in the public, private, academic, and nonprofit sectors, as well as journalism. The Institute is where the brightest minds engage to promote common ground and nonpartisan solutions. It is where American University comes to convene, communicate, and collaborate. And speaking on collaboration, we are co-sponsoring this event with Voters of AU. We do have a representative from Voters of AU outside. So if you have not registered to vote or would like some education on voting, they are outside to help and register you. Their Instagram is @VotersOfAU. Today, we are honored to have Patrice Willoughby join us. Patrice Willoughby is Senior Vice President of Global Policy and Impact at the NAACP, guiding policy for the 114-year Civil Rights Association as head of the Washington office. She has also served as Chief of Staff and Counsel to the late Congresswoman Stephanie Tubbs Jones of Ohio 11th District, the first Black woman to serve on the Tax Writing House Ways and Means Committee. Patrice later served as Executive Director of the Congressional Black Caucus and as an Obama administration appointee at the General Services Administration in Congressional Affairs. Upon leaving government, Patrice represented private sector clients for 10 years, focusing on education, financial services, health, and technology. Patrice Willoughby has joined us on campus to share her experience with activism and protest and to guide us on how we can best turn our passions into action. Please welcome Patrice Willoughby.
It is wonderful to be back for lecture number 2. Thank you, Tyler, for that terrific introduction. Thank you to the Sine Institute again for inviting me to be a part of the fellowship this spring semester, and to Voters of AU for your sponsorship, and would encourage everyone to be registered to vote because this is a critically important election. So who knows what is going to happen this week? What is significant this week?
So State of the Union is on Thursday?
Absolutely. State of the Union is on Thursday. And in our first meeting, we discussed protest movements and some of the factors that cause movements to be sustainable and to create lasting change. For those of you who were here, can anyone give me some of those examples, or I'll read some of them off.
We talked about how social movements and social media use of the information age can help to advance policy interests and create change.
Anyone else? people, sustained action, incrementalism, planning, and having multiple parts of a plan that you can pivot to if the opportunity isn't immediately right for your current or your long-term goal to come to fruition. So the State of the Union is important because as we think about advocacy planning, we have to think about the timing, the process in which the advocacy can go forward, the people who are the community of individuals that are going to help you move an issue forward, but also the coalition of people that you can move forward with. And finally, the positioning. And you can think of it positioning or press because every issue needs to be positioned in an arc of where issues that are similar might move forward. And that's why the process is really important. Process in advocacy policy is the nerdy thing. But if you learn the details of how the process works, it can also help you identify the specific points of inflection where you're going to be able to move an issue forward. I will give you a real world example this year and this past week, which is really appropriate in conjunction with AU votes. Does anyone know what bill was introduced this week in the Senate? Well, on Tuesday, the John Lewis Voting Advancement Act was reintroduced by Senator Raphael Warnock, Senator Dick Durbin, and Majority Leader Charles Schumer. Do you know why it was introduced this past week or on Tuesday?
Oh, was it because of Super Tuesday?
No, but that's a good answer.
Oh, was it because wasn't the March on Selma anniversary this week? Can't remember which day, but
Ding ding, you win the prize. So the march on the Selma commemoration of what's known as Bloody Sunday was took place on Sunday in Selma, Alabama, and the Selma commemoration happens every single year, and it memorializes the work of the civil rights movement, and in particular, John Lewis and other members of the civil rights movement who marched across the Edmund Pettus Bridge in Selma to Montgomery, and they were met by a lot of opposition and brutality by the police. That march has been going on for years, and it has a coalition of support. There's actually a nonprofit organization called the Faith and Politics Institute that always organizes a huge coalition of members of Congress, as well as other sponsors, corporations sponsor folks, and a bipartisan coalition from the House and Senate always go down to Selma, Alabama, march across the bridge in conjunction with civil rights organizations. And so the introduction of the bill this year really hits on the last part of advocacy planning, which is positioning. Now, last year in the House of Representatives, Congresswoman Terry Sewell introduced the identical bill. And so the bill has been introduced in the House and the Senate. There was a lot of press that followed the introduction of the bill, but the bill as it is not expected to move forward and be enacted into law. Who has an idea why they would have introduced it in both houses in successive years? Give me your best shot.
I was gonna say maybe like show persistence or like you're not backing off, like you're gonna keep pushing.
Persistence is really at the heart of it because persistence, sometimes it takes a long time to effectuate policy change. Last time we talked about how it took about 75 years for women to get the vote. It took around 50 years between the first decision to have a march on Washington and the enactment of the Voting Rights Act. And so policy change takes time. And this is an election year. The John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act is now being used as a tool to talk about and to elevate the issue of voting rights. Voting rights is because voting is essentially a product of state government. The federal government frames out the conditions that states must meet in order to have run their annual campaigns, as well as the presidential campaign. And by introducing the bill in successive years, when it's not going to receive consideration, it continues that it's a persistent message on the importance of voting rights in a year in which there is an election, and that leads up to January of 2025, when, if conditions are right, the bill will be reintroduced again, but there will have been continual messaging on that bill throughout this year with a coalition of folks who are interested in voting rights, so that it will be poised to be at the top of everyone's mind so that it can be moved forward and voted on in the House and the Senate. That leads to more on process. And you have this great chart and thank you to our cohort for putting together this fantastic chart on how a bill becomes a law. In advocacy planning, it's useful to be aware that there are parallel calendars that happen at the federal level and at the state level as well. And this chart, the reason why it's so beautiful is that most state legislatures do follow some form of how a bill becomes a law, and that you have a general assembly, you'll have something similar to a House, something similar to a Senate. They will have different names. And in the United States Congress, bills have to originate, when they're spending bills, they have to originate in the House, and then they're taken up in the Senate and voted on. But in the process, as at each stage represents an inflection point where a coalition of supporters actively engages the legislative process on their advocacy priorities. And so that's why the legislative calendar is important at both the state and the federal level, because often a bill that's introduced at the federal level will have a direct connection to what happens in the state. The federal calendar ends on September 30th, the end of the fiscal year, and begins again on October 1st. And many state legislatures have a similar session. Now, in terms of the legislative calendar and planning, within state legislatures, the majority of them begin the first 2 weeks of January, and they end between late March and mid-May. A lot of state legislatures are not in session for the entire year. 15 states are scheduled to have very short sessions, and only 4 states are scheduled to have longer sessions. In 2024, Louisiana, Mississippi, New Jersey, and Virginia will have the most new legislators after they held their legislative elections last fall. 4 states, Montana, Nevada, North Dakota, and Texas, only host regular sessions of their state legislature during even numbered years, and they don't have a regular session scheduled for 2024. And 4 states, Puerto Rico and our Congress, meet throughout the entirety of the year and don't generally have a typical end of session adjournment. Many states have a set cutoff when the state legislature will stop its operation. If it begins in January, maybe through March, maybe through May, or however long the session is. In the federal legislative calendar, who can tell me how long a session of Congress is?
2 years.
2 years, that's right. Also known as an election cycle. And what session of Congress are we in right now?
118.
The 118th, that's right. So every 2 years is another federal election cycle, and every 2 years, that session is known as the 118th. The last one was the 117th. The one that begins January 2025 will be the 119th. The first year is called the first session of the 119th. The second year will be known as the second session of the 119th. That's important because in our system of government, Congress and the executive branch are connected because they run on a schedule in which there is back and forth and give and take in the way that the federal budget is decided every year. The election cycle begins the process, and the new session of Congress and every January begins a time when the only thing that Congress really has to do is defend the country, provide for the common defense, and appropriate money for the running of the government. And so everything else that you see and hear on C-SPAN that doesn't fall into those 2 categories is just other stuff that Congress has decided to do. And the calendar is also important because the same pattern happens every year. And so if you tune into the process and identify what that schedule looks like, what the rhythm of both the federal legislative calendar is, as well as the rhythm of the state legislative calendars, you can identify when it's going to be important for you to weigh in with legislators at either at the federal or state level, and also many times within the local level, because all of that legislative calendar is connected to action between whether you're talking in the federal space, Congress and the executive branch, or your state government and your state government agencies. And so with the State of the Union on March 7th, we're expecting to have the president's budget introduced on March 11th. And so that follows the State of the Union this year. Typically, the president introduces the president's budget on the first Monday in February. The budget is a statement of priorities that the president has indicated that the federal government wants to work on. It is not binding. The president doesn't direct that money go here, there, and everywhere. The president simply lays out a budget, and there are dollar amounts that are attached to it, but it is a statement of priorities. This is how I would like the federal government to expend its resources this year.
So how does that work when they haven't even passed the budget from last year?
Well, I'm glad you asked that question because that's where we are right now. So who can tell me the difference between, well, who decides, how the money is allocated?
The OMB and along with the Congress.
Okay, that's good generally, absolutely. There are two types of committees in Congress: authorizing committees and appropriations committees. Does anyone know what an authorizing committee is? Okay. An authorizing committee, I'll give you the exact definition. It's a standing committee of the House or Senate with legislative jurisdiction over the operations of federal programs or agencies. And authorizing committees address discretionary spending as well as mandatory spending. The appropriations committees allocate money to federal programs. And there are 12 subcommittees that are appropriating committees. Those are the committees that decide through every level of the government where the funding is going to go. And so if you look at this, how a bill becomes a law, we know that the first Monday in February, President introduces the budget. March 7th coming up, the President will talk about the State of the Union and will indicate in that address how the federal government, what the President wants to spend money on. And then this plan kicks into action after that. So the April 1st, the Senate Budget Committee is going to introduce a framework that fits within how much money the government is going to spend overall. And after that's voted on in the House and Senate, it's an agreement. It doesn't have legislative, it's not binding, but it is essentially the House and Senate saying, we agree we're going to spend this amount of money for the next federal year. Then the process kicks in where the authorizing committees have already introduced changes that they may make to programs. The appropriations committees are going to have a series of hearings on those programs because they're going to be debating the funding levels for specific programs. So what does that mean to you as an advocate if you are aware of the process? Who can give me an idea?
It's a really crucial time for lobbying because you want to try and get your issues at the top of the budget priority.
That's right. That's right. So the federal appropriations process is probably the most overlooked tool that advocates really don't pay attention to, because if you watch the calendar of when the appropriations hearings are going on, you can reverse engineer when a specific issue is going to be considered by a committee. And that is the point, if you back up in a timeline where you can determine how, who, and when you need to have contact with your elected officials, either in their home office, in their home district office, or at the federal level.
And when you were chief of staff, what would these days actually look like for you? Like what is the Congresswoman's expectations as chief of staff? What are you doing? I'm just curious. Were you ever in the chamber when the speech was given, or are you kind of back in your office?
I have been in the chamber when the speech is given, and it's really exhilarating because you have and it used to freak me out a little bit as well, because you have the entirety of the government in one room. Now, there are a few people who stay back in a secured location, in case something happens. But you have the House, the Senate, the Supreme Court justices, the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the head of the military, the judiciary, and everybody's there and you're up in the gallery, and it's also probably the safest place on earth, but it's and if you look at video of old addresses, it used to be a lot more bipartisan. So, the president will say something and then everybody will applaud. Some people enthusiastically, some people not so enthusiastically. Now, when you look at it, it's kind of like a free for all. One side will just sit there and look unhappy. The other side will wildly cheer, and that goes back and forth. And a lot of that is because when C-SPAN came on board, the cable companies began to offer C-SPAN, and the proceedings began to be televised widely. The members of Congress realized that they could make a statement by how they appeared on camera. And so now, there's pressure on people to not applaud. There is that things are going on, like people try to get a seat on the aisle so that they can get in the picture frame as the president comes down the aisle. And there's a lot of political theater about it. But that's not the important work. The important work is the process that goes after the State of the Union, because you're going to have a budget resolution that needs to be introduced by the House and Senate, an agreement on how much to spend, and then this process that kicks in when the appropriations committees begin to have hearings on all of the spending that is in the federal government. And there are 13 appropriation subcommittees. And so to your question about what needs to happen, by the end of September, the government is supposed to agree on the spending for the next year. That bill is supposed to be voted on and signed into law so that at the beginning of the next fiscal year, you have the next year's budget that goes forward. The political dysfunction that exists now means that it's very, very difficult to arrive at, one, an agreement on how much money to spend, and then two, there's a lot of disagreement about what the program should be on the authorizing side and people wanting to change those programs. And then on the appropriation side, how much those programs really should be funded at. So, for example, during the pandemic, additional funding was provided for SNAP benefits because a lot of people were out of work. And so a lot more people in the country began to tap into SNAP benefits. And now even some folks have not recovered economically. There are efforts to want to pull back that funding because that's what the government was spending before, adjusted for inflation. And so that creates the kind of tug of war that prevents the process to go on at its regular schedule. What has ended up happening over the past 10 years, because the process has not functioned effectively, is that the negotiations go on until a couple of weeks before the end of the fiscal year. And then what needs to happen is that the government might shut down because no additional money has been appropriated. And so Congress will be forced to pass what's known as a continuing resolution. A continuing resolution is an agreement that we're just going to continue the budget as it was in the past year. We're going to spend at the levels that we spent last year. We're not making any changes to programs, and that continuing resolution will be made for some period of time. This past year, we've had already one series of continuing resolutions. This week, another series of continuing resolutions are getting ready to expire. And so Congress is now in the process of that negotiation where they know that the federal government will shut down unless they enact a continuing resolution, or they move forward on what's known as an omnibus. An omnibus is all of the federal appropriation spending bills that are in one bill that gets passed. Those are the bills that you hear about that have 1,000 or so pages. People don't have an opportunity to read them, in great detail, but the time pressure is on members of Congress so that if they don't pass it, the government will shut down. And so that means that people don't get their benefits. It means that your national parks close, and all of the things that people depend on with government that are a little bit invisible. You don't see how they operate. They just operate, will shut down. There are some protections in law that protect against things like Social Security and Medicare and other payments like that being stopped if Congress fails to do its job and pass the budget. So with that as a backdrop, I think it's a good time to talk about mandatory spending and discretionary spending. Who can give me a definition? Who knows what mandatory spending is?
This stuff is just completely set by the government that doesn't change. So Medicare, Medicaid, stuff like that.
Absolutely right. So mandatory spending is sometimes called entitlement spending. And do you know how much of the federal budget is mandatory?
I don't know.
About 2/3. About 2/3 of the budget is mandatory spending, and that's Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid. These are the programs that are on autopilot, and anyone who qualifies for them can access them. Congress doesn't appropriate money to them. There is a formula that automatically kicks in on mandatory spending. That means that the rest of the spending is discretionary spending. And that is where this chart is important, because that's also where a lot of the changes in both the programs as well as the funding levels are discussed. About 45% of that 1/3 goes to salaries and benefits for government employees, both military and civilian, and about 15% goes to grants to state and local government. And most of the remainder goes to purchase goods and services. So that discretionary spending is where you see things like transportation funding, workforce development funding, reproductive rights funding. That's where you see the intersection of the federal government and the state government, because those funds are authorized at the federal level in a program. The funding goes into and is allocated through the appropriations process. And then the executive branch takes over and allocates that money to the states. And so that is another opportunity where, if you are following the money and how federal funding flows through that pipeline, you'll understand where you can also make a difference at your local level to advocate for changes in your community. And I'll send this out for everyone to have. There are a number of reports that you can access that will allow you to track through federal government websites funds that have come into a state and locality. Often now, because of a lot of open government rules, there is often a contact listed for each state as well. So there's someone that you can call and ask questions about. If you have questions about how federal funding or that process is affecting your state. There's also, I'm going to send out this report from the Congressional Research Service. This was updated just a couple of weeks ago, February 23rd, 2024. The Congressional Research Service is the think tank of Congress, and it is a function of the Library of Congress. There are specialists that write reports. Sometimes they update them on a regular basis. Sometimes they do specific targeted research at the request of congressional offices. And it's nonpartisan, very good information that can also walk you through how specific programs are developed, what the timeline is on them. There's usually a program officer listed in the report that can also be a point of contact for questions that you might have. These reports were previously only available to members of Congress, but in recent years, they have become publicly available on public databases. And so sometimes, last time we talked about misinformation and disinformation, and it can be difficult to understand the perspective of a report if you're reading it from an advocacy group. But the Congressional Research Service is nonpartisan. They basically look at the data, they look at the programs, they go back to the legislative history of why something was developed and how it's supposed to operate. And it can be a very, very good resource if you're just trying to get a good outline on how something operates.
So you said for mandatory spending, it's 2/3 of the budget. So Congress really doesn't decide how much money goes there. No. So is it really possible for them to cut Medicare, Medicaid, and Social Security, or is that just a talking point?
It is possible. It is very, very difficult. So in order to do it, you need to have agreement between the House, Senate, and the White House. Medicare and Medicaid, also, if you look at the propensity to vote of different groups of people, the group that votes with the highest consistency are seniors and people who are going to benefit from Medicare, Medicaid, and Social Security. And so there are a lot of different things that have to happen in order for those programs to be cut. But those ideas have been discussed a lot over a period of years because of the size of the spending that is devoted to mandatory spending and the entitlement programs. That's going to shrink as that biggest cohort of folks, get older and are deceased. But there are a lot of things that have to line up. So, for example, if you had an authorizing bill that wanted to cut Medicare spending, that bill would have to make it out of the House. It would have to be passed in the Senate. It would have to be signed into law by the president. Then, the appropriators would have another crack at it because then those spending levels would have to be reviewed as well. So there are lots of different places where that process can be derailed. But using it as a talking point, the talking point of cutting Social Security and Medicare is so unpopular. Take that back. It's very popular with one group of people. It's very unpopular with another group of people. So when that proposal comes up, it's always used as a scare tactic to speak to folks who want Social Security and Medicare, to gin them up to vote against the other side.
My understanding, that group generally would be, and correct me if I'm wrong, more so conservative. And so with that, especially with how politics is going now, and there's this big distrust of government or anything that comes out of this government, especially with that administration, how can you connect with those reports and say, hey, this is a bipartisan resource? These reports are here to show you what's actually happening, but there's that complete disconnect of like, oh, it came out of the government, I don't even look at it or touch that.
So that's a really good question, but I think that we have gotten away from discussing the merits of policy, and we've gotten away from discussing things like the solvency of the programs and their cost as opposed relative to the size of the budget and the population that are going to support them. Because we don't really, the American public doesn't really have a good understanding of how the programs operate, it allows the discussion to remain way up here when it should be way down here and very, very detail oriented. I turn that off. Okay. And so, ideologically speaking, a lot of folks on the conservative side want to cut spending, period. And so that's the starting point for negotiation. On the more progressive side, folks want everyone to have access to Social Security and Medicare and would prefer for some other cuts to take place. And so that those two sides are never going to have a conversation on the merits unless they can get behind closed doors and do a little bit of horse trading. But that's not likely to happen, and especially not in an election year, because no one on either side wants to be seen as compromising with the other side. So what I've noticed in government over the past 20 years is that conversation keeps getting kicked down the road. Now what will eventually happen is that people who are your generation and a smaller cohort of people to support the older generation that's going to need Social Security and Medicare, the program will get to the point where there is no choice. It's going to either, if we're talking about Social Security and Medicare, either the level of benefits will have to be reduced or taxes that people pay will have to increase because the math won't be mathing. Right? So, but there isn't political will as a forcing, as long as it's like we can continue to push it into the future, people will continue to do that. That's also how some of the advocacy movements of younger people have taken hold too, in terms of, having a rational basis to look at the federal budget, right? Because if the older folks don't do something about Social Security and Medicare, then, it's incredibly greedy to be acting in self-interest and not thinking about, the future solvency of the program, Things were not that great in the 1930s during the Depression before there were Social Security and Medicare. And unfortunately, all we have now are a lot of pictures and personal accounts of it. But people were dying in the streets, and poverty at the Great Depression was a real thing. Social Security and Medicare, Social Security is also a disability program as well. So if you're young and disabled, you can receive Social Security benefits. So for that, reason as well, some rationality has to be brought to it. So that is, let me stop there. Any more questions before I move forward? Please.
Just really quickly, I know there's been a few challenges on the Supreme Court side for Medicare and Medicaid healthcare, because this is such a legislative issue. If it were to be overturned by judicial lens, would that be enough to kind of uproot mandatory spending, or how does those checks and balances work?
Could you repeat the question?
Like when there was specific challenges to Medicare and Medicaid, I think it's happened twice or so. If that were to have been successful, or if that kind of comes down the pipeline again and it is successful, how does that decision impact mandatory spending that's been enshrined on a legislative end?
Sure. So typically when the Supreme Court returns or invalidates, a federal law, they typically, they often use either a jurisdiction issue or they often will use there will be an equal protection issue. What I could see happening is that there would be a return, or the court might indicate that Congress needs to refine or change the federal law. And the court can't do that. So they would put it right back on Congress to determine and reform how mandatory spending is conducted, or the formula, or whatever the issue might be. The court might also invalidate provisions of how the budget is, the details of how the budget is constructed. They can't invalidate the federal budget process because that's constitutionally defined. So it would be the details of specific programs, formula, and other discretionary and operational aspects of what Congress does that they would return to Congress to fix. So we spent a lot of time on the budget because budget and spending is everything. I mean, budget and spending is everything. So, when we think about protest and activism and, we talked about policy, process, and politics last session. The budget is firmly in that category of process. So as you are focused on advocacy planning, the first thing that we do in advocacy planning is define the issue. If we're talking about any of these issues, what is it that needs to be fixed? And often the point that you can go to is there something that is regulatory? Is this a law? Is this a matter of the federal budget? Is this something like a program that is being developed or that's not spending money appropriately? That we should hone in on the specifics of the technical issue that is pushing money in a way or keeping money away from something that we want to fix, because that is a lot more directed than protesting and saying, fix X. You can say fix X, but what are you telling a policymaker to do? Right? And your strategy and your plan comes out of what specifically it is that you want this legislator to fix and who's responsible for fixing it. So define the issue. Is it legislation? Is it policy? Is it federal, state, or local? Is there funding attached to it? The next, what's the legislative calendar and budget cycle? And so we spend a lot of time talking about the budget cycle because as that issue winds its way, whether it is budgetary or some other piece of legislation that's going through Congress or your state legislature, what are the points on this map when that issue might be receiving a hearing? Or can you, working in conjunction by yourself or in coalition, build up enough support to push attention toward an issue? and get your state legislature, your local legislature, your federal officials to have a hearing, to draw attention to it. I'll give you a specific example. I worked as a multi-client lobbyist. There was an issue that was disadvantaging a client of mine, and they were a little tiny company. They were up against 3 other giant companies that had most of the market on their issue. And they were right, but the conventional wisdom favored the big 3 companies because they operated in one way and my client operated in another way. And so the issue was so specialized that I knew that no one was really paying attention to it. We needed to reframe the entire debate. We needed to draw attention to a conflict of interest that caused and created an advantage for these large 3 companies. And so I worked on redefining the issue. We developed our 1-page document of the issue in plain language. This is what's happening. This is why there are some distortions in, the financial markets because of this issue. And this is what you should do as a policymaker. Then did about 65 meetings with individual offices to explain the issue, to define the issue, to get everyone who is involved in making decisions on that issue aware of the problem, because it wasn't something that people were focusing on. That goes to point 3, identify your champions. So I had to think about who's going to be in my corner if, these 3 large companies have most of the market and everyone agrees with them because they're so powerful. How can I develop a coalition that's going to go with me and support what my little tiny company is doing? And so I identified consumer advocates. I identified members of Congress who were interested in financial markets working and being more equitable for everyone. I identified businesses that had been disadvantaged by the larger companies, and just developed a coalition of those folks and met with all of them, described the issue to all of them. I looked at the legislative calendar. When was the regulatory agency that manages all 3 of those, the 3 large companies and the my small client, when were they having their budget hearing? And then we were able to get some members of Congress who understood the issue because of these meetings to ask questions to the head of that agency about that issue. That put the issue in an elevated spotlight. We had done all of the legwork surrounding it, but that hearing, which was not on the issue, it was on the budget of the agency, that head of the agency had to address the issue. And that gave us the tool to continue the advocacy and look for other times during the legislative calendar when we could return to the same issue and ask questions of other federal officials. And so the Federal Reserve goes up to Congress and they make a quarterly report in both the House and the Senate. And for a year, every time they came up to make a report on the operation of the economy, there was a member of Congress that would raise the issue in both the House and the Senate. And so that cadence of continually placing and having people raise questions on that specific issue continued to elevate it. So we kept it out in front of people. That was the first step towards actually changing the law. But it was continuing to have that drumbeat, and repetition that kept the issue alive.
Okay. I like all you're saying and everything, but I must say I have to ask you this question. I'm an intern on Capitol Hill, and we get a lot of phone calls about a lot of issues and stuff, and one being the ceasefire in Gaza. And we got immigration because the congressman put in immigration bill. And the majority of the times, I'm not going to hold you, it's the same people, and it's the same thing from different people. And I'm like this. I put the phone like that. And then I already know what they're going to say. And so I put it in a log on the computer system, and I send it away, and I'm like, okay, thank you, have the rest of the day. And my congressman doesn't really look at it. And I questioned the legislative director on that. And I said, these folks are really passionate about their issue and something that they really care about. And here I am, just an intern. I could only do but so much. The congressman isn't going to take their phone calls or anything. He's mainly on the phone with donors and stuff. I understand, Congress, the House is just for 2 years and stuff, but is it really worth it, right? These folks care about issues, and they're calling their representatives, and they're talking to interns, and their representatives won't even, they won't take their phone calls or anything. I understand the ceasefire is getting a lot of attention, but I'm gonna say that the George Floyd bill is still sitting on the Senate floor. I like everything you're saying, but I question what's going on up there also. I enjoy it. Not gonna hold you. If you want it, you should do it. And you should do it. But I enjoy it. But that's my issue with the internship. He's not taking the calls. I am.
So I would ask in response, because you know how this is going to go. I'm going to ask you a question. What's missing from the fact that everyone's making the telephone calls?
I don't see many folks coming into the office.
Okay.
We got one group that came in, but we don't see many people coming into the office and stuff.
So I would want to know, since the member of Congress spends a lot of the time on the phone with donors, are any of those folks in his fundraisers? Are any of them raising that question to him directly when he's dialing the dollars?
I personally do not know that, but I do understand that he did have a town hall with folks that had questions about the ceasefire, and he gave the generic answers, the ones that his team told him to say and stuff, and it's he's really not good.
So the answer is, because I had the same experience when I was on Capitol Hill. We had regular callers, and but sometimes words are just empty words. When people call, it's generally because they feel very passionate about something, but they also don't do anything about it. So, like you said, they're not visiting the office. They'll show up at a town hall, but at the same time, it will be a lively discussion and nothing will follow on. So that's why an integrated advocacy plan is really critically important. Call, the visit, the town hall meeting, voting. We just had Super Tuesday yesterday, and we had the Michigan primary last week. I was listening to a lot of the discussion about Israel and Gaza and the significant Muslim population in Dearborn. They had, I think, about 100,000 people who voted uncommitted. And at the same time, you began to see the dialogue of the administration shifting to accommodate that language of ceasefire. Do you think that there's any connection between that?
Could the everyday average American really make a difference? Because they come in, but they're not meeting with him. Granted, he could be on the floor. He does have to vote himself. But the majority of times I see that he is, and this is no hate towards the Congress or anything. I'm just saying, I'm just telling you,
If you're watching, Congress.
if you're watching, let's make sure he doesn't get the win. He's mainly with, again, a donor, a journalist, or friends. And it's like, other regular folks are meeting with either legislative correspondent or the legislative director.
So this is where people don't understand the power that they have working in conjunction with each other. Lots of disparate people, everybody going in, meeting about the same issue individually, or, write your rep, clicking a box on a computer. When I was on Capitol Hill, it was individual letters. We get individual letters. Okay, that's great. The power of democracy is the power of people working in coalition together. And it's the power of organizing. It's the power of collective action. It's the power of an advocacy plan. So it's not, yes, everyone should engage civically, but I think it's critically important when you want to move change along that you align yourself with folks who are working on the same set of issues, so that you have all of the tools in an advocacy strategy that that can be operated, as in coordination, even if people are working on different things. People don't recognize their own power, and you can. You're more likely to be able to meet with a congressperson in their district than in Washington, D.C., because when they're in their district, they're at home and they're trying to do the one-on-one meetings with their constituents. That's when also they will go to grocery stores, they'll stand in the parking lot, they will campaign. And during election season is a really critical time because they're always out in the community. So, people shouldn't just act individually, but organize. A few years back, we saw the movement Indivisible come up, which really gave communities some very good organizing tools for people to organize as a neighborhood, as a set of people who are interested in a specific issue, and to work collectively and push on specific issues. That's really, really important. And that's where you've seen that misinformation and disinformation, click activism, right, has really, really supplanted that coordinated action, where people feel good because they've done something, but then nothing comes because of it. When a member of Congress, and I have to add this too, there is redistricting, and the political environment is also critically important in this. So congressional districts right now, we talked about apportionment and about the census a little bit last time. Every 10 years, there's a census. Redistricting and gerrymandering has created congressional districts that are not competitive. So the incentive for members of Congress is only to have to talk to people who agree with them. The redistricting progress in this country really needs to focus instead of gerrymandering on redrawn congressional districts that are competitive. In some states, they're not going to be competitive because you have one party versus another that dominates. But when politicians have to compete for your vote on the basis of ideas, as opposed to playing to the far reaches of either party, we will get better government. And that means that there are advocacy organizations that work on redistricting. If and when you get to a point where you can't be physically involved in something, maybe you write a check and fund that work. Because we are getting the quality of democracy that we have allowed to happen by not paying attention. And not you, and people who are my age. Have allowed to happen because people have lost their connection with the democracy that they can actually make a difference. And so that's why having this long-term view on how to engage has to happen. And then, you're right to, sometimes those calls get to be a lot.
So I had a question about something so a thing you always hear is that members of Congress aren't the ones who actually do all of the work. That is the people who are behind the scenes. So somebody who's been a chief of staff, how true is the idea that most of the work happens among the staff? I know people talk about the 30-year-olds who are really, really running Congress because they're the ones ushering things around, writing all the bills. And
24.
20.
The average age actually of a congressional staff person is around 28. And that's absolutely true. But the role of staff is to make recommendations to members of Congress. Some of my friends and I were discussing, a few years back that people who were older needed to go back to Capitol Hill, more of a holistic view of how government operates and the private sector operates in order to lend, a little bit of balance to that. But it is absolutely true that an internship will lead to a job as a staff assistant, answering the mail. I always told people the person that controls the mail controls the office because you have a bird's eye view of everything that's going on and what's important. Staff assistants lead to being a legislative correspondent where you're writing the letters. So sometimes there is an archive of letters. Sometimes that young person is doing the research, getting the points, and writing the letter, right? They have to get it okay through another staff person or the member, but they're effectively the putting their stamp on the member of Congress, their position on an issue. That also, if you are a young person and you're involved in political or in advocacy planning, it is a huge opportunity because people who are just a little older than you are the people who are making the recommendations to the member of Congress. And so, that one-on-one with, and engaging with the office of a member of Congress can result in you having, a really outsized influence on how that policy is shaped. If you come in with a group of friends to talk about something that's really critically important. People do things for people that they get along with. I can't underscore enough the importance of respectful dialogue and, being open-minded, and also when you disagree, learning how to disagree in an agreeable way, because that keeps the doors of dialogue open and it allows you to continue to have discussions. When I was a chief of staff, I used to like to answer the phone because it told me who was nice to the people on the front desk and who wasn't nice, because sometimes people lose themselves, don't they? Yeah, they lose themselves, and they'll come in and they'll start making demands because they think that the person on the phone is a 23-year-old staff assistant. And they'll talk down to the person on the front desk, and it'd be great if all of those people got banned from never coming in, right? Because it would send a message as well. So
I think it's interesting that Matthew brought that up too, because sometimes we use the term public service just for elected officials, but like the work that Tyler's doing, the work that you did, like that's public service. And so for so many people in the room who might be considering, you might never be an elected official, but you can be a public servant in different ways. And I think that's a really important part. And when we see some of that deterioration in trust, when we say public service, we're losing something because we're keeping out a whole sector of people who are doing this work.
You're absolutely right. It is service because, but it's vitally important service. So I think that, doing an internship, working on Capitol Hill or in a state house, working in a nonprofit organization that has interaction with those policymakers is really critically important, because all of those jobs give you a lens into the process, the unfun stuff, right? But your ability to move the process along really relates to how well you understand the process and the different points where you can actually make a difference in it. And, with the battle of that, the legislative branch also has to get money from the appropriators. And so what has happened in years on and off is that there have been efforts to reduce the funding of the legislative branch because the progressives were trying to fund it at a higher level to bump up the salaries. People can't afford to work on Capitol Hill. That causes the institutional knowledge and people who have a vested interest in government functioning well to leave right at the point when they can make a difference. When that happens, we end up having many of the situations that we have now. People are there for a year, 2 years, then they're out because they can't afford to live, in Washington, D.C. or in an expensive place. And people get tired of living 5 people in a house. They want to have an apartment. They want to have a life. So the funding of government is really also critically important to the sustainability and the stability of the institutions so that people will make a career in government. Congress took a while, but has the student debt repayment program so that people who had student loans could afford to stay on Capitol Hill for a while longer. And other benefits as well. But being at the intersection of policy and can definitely be a huge benefit to understanding where the cycle, the yearly cycle, who is coming in, who's very active, who isn't very active, the different tactics and strategies that organizations use, as well as the weaknesses in the arguments and how different constituencies will come in and interact with the staff to try to push forward on an issue.
I just have a question. So how can the erosion of trust that we're seeing from the American people in our institutions, but specifically Congress, ultimately impact advocacy efforts?
So the erosion of trust means that people tune out, right? And they're really susceptible to anything that they read or see on TikTok. It's very dangerous. It's very dangerous. And so I think that, everybody has a role to play in understanding, one, what are the trusted sources of information, right, that you read? The second thing is, if you're interested in policy and government, then you are a change agent within your circle, because you have the ability, when someone is sending around a story, or they're amplifying something that it's going to depress people, or make them not want to vote or engage, to draw attention to why they shouldn't send that story out, because there are no mechanisms currently other than people. And now we have AI, generative AI. There was an international convening a few weeks ago where the big tech platforms have decided not to use generative AI in election ads across the world, because this is a problem in every democracy. These misinformation and disinformation campaigns are popping up to try to prevent people from voting and from exercising their rights. This is also why France, I was reading, is now the first country to enshrine in its constitution a woman's right to choose. Right? It's now constitutional protection because of a lot of those dynamics. I'm going to stop here and see if there are any other questions, because I know.
I guess I just had a question about the gerrymandering issue. So I know that in a lot of states, it's left up to like an independent like commission, or sometimes it's up to like the governor's office. So like, how can advocacy like work? How does it fit into that process? Because I know it's different than like the usual legislative process, and it's harder to impact it directly.
It is. So every state gets to decide how their state apportionment goes. It's like one of the craziest things, right? And there are two pieces of federal legislation. There's the John Lewis Voting Rights Enhancement Act. There's also the Freedom to Vote Act. And the Freedom to Vote Act has some provisions in it that would be federal and determine, how apportionment should be carried out by states. But that's always been voting has always been a state issue. So as an individual, the attention has to be paid at the state level. Research on which nonprofits are doing that advocacy work within a state, because there have been a million different commissions and boards that have popped up. There are a number of national organizations that are focused on apportionment, both on the conservative and the progressive side. So it's really finding the organization that is doing the type of work that you think needs to be done, and then affiliating with them and just leaning in with yourself and others who are really interested in the issue, because apportionment, gerrymandering, and campaign finance, legislators can pass any type of laws, but if we get the very framework, the infrastructure wrong, then the voices of people are not going to be heard. And that's the tension that you see a lot in the fact that there has been probably a 50-year push to control those mechanisms of apportionment, and so, pushing back is absolutely necessary.
Just kind of going back to the point about advocacy before, this is great. And it's a great thing that I think a lot of people should have access to. So kind of it's a two-part question. How do you kind of allow people to have an easier time going down the advocacy route? And then on the flip side, how do you kind of make the elected officials more willing to listen to those people that are kind of doing it the traditional way, rather than kind of acting on more kind of backdoor agendas?
Sure. So how do you make public officials more accountable? Public officials are very attuned to their fundraising, and they're attuned to people. Last time we talked about money, people. You've got to have one or both, preferably both, because that's what they pay attention to. there's too much disengagement. The only solution is to lean in and become the bad penny. Because once someone is elected, the power of incumbency is huge. They send out, what's called franked mail, which are, the government printed newsletters. You can't do it like 90 days before an election, but you've got a huge pulpit. So the only thing that works is staying continually engaged, working in conjunction and in coalitions with people. Campaign finance, yes, we need to reform the campaign finance system, but until we do, this is the system that we have. So if you are able to donate to a campaign, if it's $10, if it's $5, the largest growth in campaign contributions over the past 20 years has been in the small donor fundraising. And that puts you on a continual email trail with those elected officials, and then you show up. There's nothing that gets their attention more than saying, I'm a donor, and your constituent, and I would like to meet with you personally.
With going into that, what are some of the major differences you've seen since campaign donating became unlimited in the 2010s to like re-election and lobbying dynamics, like Jeff Miller and his new, approach, and corporations? What has been some of the drastic changes that have accompanied that?
So the biggest drastic change has been skullduggery, right? The unregulated and invisible contributions that have come from super PACs. I think that lobbyists get a bad rap in a lot of ways. I was one. But any contribution that I made that was over $200, it went into a public database, right? When Congress enacted changes to the lobbying disclosure rules and the campaign finance rules, it didn't affect me at all because I continued to everything that I reported. I always reported, that those reports get done on two sides. The campaigns report them and the individuals report them, and then they get matched up. So if one entity is not reporting and the other is, then that creates a paper trail right there. That's not what people have to worry about so much, because there are also the limits on what individuals contribute. The danger is in super PACs and other, shadow uncoordinated efforts that are not affiliated with a campaign, but that are issue-based, but they're really affiliated with the campaign. And that's what the Citizens United decision did, is that it equated the rights of corporations with free speech. Essentially, corporations are people. And so they can fund and help fund issue campaigns. That money is not publicly reported. There's a lot of that money that it's not reported. So during a campaign, during an election, you see the proliferation of ads that pop up, and there are organizations that just go into a media market if there is a close election, and they buy all of the advertising time on local television, and then they run ads continually, because they understand that running oppositional ads against someone, it does a couple of things. One, it tarnishes the name of the person. Two, it depresses the vote. People get really turned off with negative ads. And so that's also a tactic. If you flood the television and the internet with negative ads, right? You can prevent people from voting because they're like, I want no part of this. Okay, well, you have your plan and your strategy. Next time I come back, we may be joined by a couple of special guests, but I want you to look at this planning document and next time I want to drill down and answer any questions about some of the specifics of using this grid in order to frame out a short and a long-term plan on an issue that you're interested in working on.
Thank you all so much again for joining us today, and thank you so much, Patrice, for a second absolutely incredible session. If you're looking to come to the next event, the dates are on the poster outside. I forgot to. So, but the dates are on big poster outside, and we have some postcards if you would like to take them as a reminder as well. We have 2 more events this week additionally, the next one being tomorrow. And I hope we see you all again soon. And thank you again to Voters of AU for co-sponsoring with us. Please check out their table if you haven't on the way out.
Thank you.
Yeah.